Greetings, class. I just wanted to create a brief YouTube clip to discuss in a little bit more depth the other type of t-tests for two samples that is detailed in Chapter 9 in SPATS, and that is the t-test for paired samples. Now, as you may recall from a previous YouTube clip, when we say two samples are paired, that means that they are linked in some way. Linked in some way that it goes beyond whatever we might be interested in. The example I gave briefly in a prior YouTube clip was mothers and daughters. Let's say, for example, you wanted to determine whether or not mothers and daughters make the same amount of money or a significantly different amount of money. That's again a completely legitimate inquiry. Perhaps an inquiry like that speaks to whether or not wages are increasing over time or what have you. However, if you wanted to do that, that comparison, comparing a group of mothers to their daughters in terms of their average income over the life course, you would need to conduct a t-test for two samples, except because you're analyzing or comparing mothers and daughters, you can't call those samples independent of one another. In fact, quite the opposite, they are paired. Therefore, you would need a t-test for paired samples. Here's another example of a situation, a research environment that would require a t-test for paired samples. That would be a situation where perhaps you might be interested in determining whether or not a training has an effect. For example, here at UMKC, I recently was required to, and all faculty and staff, and maybe even students too, but all faculty for sure were required to participate in an online training all about internet security. And in order to determine how effective that training is, the people who programmed the training asked us to participate in a pre-test. All right, so all of us that were going to engage in the training took a pre-test, testing our knowledge about internet security before we went through the online training. And then, after we went through the training, we were then asked to take the same test. So, pre-test, post-test situation. And in an effort to determine whether or not the training was effective, I'm guessing that they're going to compare the average scores of the training before folks engaged in the training and compare that to the average scores after people engaged in the training. Again, that's a perfectly legitimate research inquiry. However, we can't consider those two groups of scores, pre-test, post-test, when they came from the same group of people. We can't consider those scores independent. We can't consider that's those samples of data independent of one another, because they're not. They came from the same person. So if you have 200 faculty and they all take a pre-test, and then those same 200 faculty go through the training, and then those same 200 faculty take the post-test, you've got two sets of scores, pre-scores and post-scores, and you can calculate means, the pre-mean score and the post-mean score of those two scores. But those scores, all those data points, all those cases, all that information came from the same group of people, the same 200 faculty. So you would require a t-test for paired samples. Now, here's the good news. The only difference between a t-test for independent samples and a t-test for paired samples is simply how the standard error of the difference gets calculated. Now, in the previous YouTube clips, assuming you've watched them, we went over in some detail how the denominator of the t formula, in other words, the standard error of the difference, or I also refer to it as the combined measure of standard error. We went over in some detail how that was calculated. When it comes to a t-test for paired samples, that's really the only difference between a t-test for independent samples and a t-test for paired samples is how the standard error is calculated. So if you would, go ahead and turn to page 207 and 208 and 209, for that matter, in your book. And those pages, if you haven't gone over those pages yet, I would implore you to do so, just simply to familiarize yourself with how the standard error of the difference gets calculated in a t-test for paired samples. Those pages really go over that, and again, we're not going to do any of those examples in class, but that is something that I want you to be familiar with. So again, in sum, the point of this particular YouTube clip is simply to revisit the other type of t-test for two samples that's detailed in Chapter 9, and that is the t-test for not independent samples, but rather the t-test for paired samples, to explain a little bit about what we mean by two samples that are paired. That means that they are related in some fashion. And also to highlight the main difference between the calculation of data-generated t, the main difference between t-test for independent samples and the t-test for paired samples, and that difference is simply how the standard error of the difference is calculated.